All right. Thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you especially for choosing to spend your summer evening with us here at the library, talking about philosophy. My name is Jim Ramsey. I'm the head of adult services here at the Middleton Public Library. So if any of you have been to events here before, you've probably seen me and you've heard some of the spiel that I'm about to give. So you just have to sit through it. But I'm in charge of all the events, workshops, classes, lectures, book talks, etc. For adults here at the library. So this lecture is the third of this year, of 2017, in an ongoing series that we're calling Scholared for Life. This series, which is in its second year now, is presented by the Middleton Public Library in partnership with the UW-Madison Speakers Bureau. It takes the Wisconsin idea as its starting point. It aims to promote lifelong learning, intellectual curiosity, and engagement between academics and the community as a whole. There's been a great response to this series ever since we launched it in February of 2016, and we really appreciate it. I really appreciate it, your support. So mark your calendars. The next lecture in this series will be on September 21st. We'll feature Laura Albert, Associate Professor of Industrial and Systems Engineering, author of the blog Punk Rock Operations Research. The exact topic we're still working on as TBD, but her field, operations research, uses mathematical models to aid decision-making, everything from cybersecurity to battling epidemics, planning marathon routes, and getting aid supplies to victims in disaster areas. So the topic will be posted on our website, midlibrary.org/SFL, Scholar for Life. You can go there and see, also you can see links to videos of the first two lectures from this year. We had Russian history professor David McDonald talking about Putin's Russia back in March, very timely topic. And we had Kathy Kramer, the professor of political science, here in May, just last month, talking about her book. So before I go on, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Middleton Public Library. The Friends of the Middleton Public Library, they are the nonprofit organization that supports all of the programming at the library. Not everyone knows this. All of the programming, from programming for adults to events for little kids, is funded by the Friends of the Middleton Public Library. They raise funds primarily through book sales, but we're also we're offering copies of Professor Nadler's newest book here tonight for sale through a special arrangement with Princeton University Press, and a portion of the proceeds will go to the Friends. So another way that you can support the Friends is by becoming a member of the Friends. I'm here to tell you, anybody can be a member of the Friends of the Middleton Public Library. You don't even have to live in Middleton. There's a brochure on the table on your way out if you're interested in that. There's also a little box if you want to contribute, no obligation. Programs here are always free, but in the past people have asked how they can contribute to programming here at the library, and that is one way. So as I said, copies of Professor Nadler's latest book, Heretics, The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, are available for purchase at courtesy of Princeton University Press. It's an illustrated history of 17th century philosophy. His son Ben, graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, provided the illustrations for the book. And after the lecture, we'll have some time for Q&A, and then Professor Nadler will sign copies of the book. All right. So our guest this evening is a William H. Hay Professor of Philosophy and Evjue-Bascom Professor in Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on philosophy in the 17th century. He has written extensively on Descartes and Cartesianism, Spinoza, and Leibniz. He also works on medieval and early modern Jewish philosophy. His publications include Spinoza, A Life, which won the Koret Jewish Book Award, and Rembrandt's Jews, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. More recent works include A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age, and The Philosopher, the Priest, and the Painter, A Portrait of Descartes. He recently served as the editor of the Journal of the History of Philosophy and has held visiting professorships at Stanford University and the University of Chicago, as well as universities in Amsterdam and Paris. Please join me in welcoming Professor Steven Nadler.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight. So we're going to talk about evil, and because our time is limited, we're only going to cover about 2,000 years. We'll take it up to 1677. Of course, the real problem for evil in Jewish thought occurs much later than that with the Holocaust, where the issue of evil, and especially collective evil facing an entire people, becomes a much more difficult issue. But I'm afraid that's a topic for a completely different discussion. So let's begin by first, aside about the primitive PowerPoint, a 12-year-old could have done a much fancier job, but I don't have the PowerPoint skills of a 12-year-old. So it's just black and white. All right, so the problem of evil is this. There's suffering, imperfection, sin, and evil in the world. By itself, that's not a problem. Why shouldn't there be? We don't have any moral expectations that nature's going to treat us one way or the other. Without some additional assumptions, you just have to take it as it comes. Nature brings good things your way, and nature brings bad things your way. In fact, some philosophers would say that nature's neither good nor bad. Whatever happens just happens. So if all you're thinking about is that there's suffering, sin, and imperfection in the world, there's no problem. The problem only arises when you take an additional assumption that the world was created by an all-wise, all-knowing, perfectly just, wise, and good God. Now we have a bit of a challenge. How can we reconcile these two facts? The fact that this world was created by an infinitely perfect being, and yet the world at least appears to be full of imperfections. How can we reconcile these two things? Well, here's one possible solution. You could say that God knows about the evils, God would like to do something about them, but God can't do something about them. However, that solution won't work, because that would undermine God's alleged omnipotence. If there's something that God couldn't do about the evils, then God's not truly omnipotent. But one of the assumptions is that God is omnipotent. So that solution won't work. Here's another solution. God knows about the evils, God could do something about them, but chooses not to. What's wrong with that solution? Right, that would undermine God's alleged goodness. So that solution won't work either, because God is supposed to be infinitely just and good. Here's another solution. God could do something about the evils, and God would do something about them if only God knew about them. Can't have that, because that would undermine divine omniscience. God is supposed to be all-knowing, and so if God didn't know about the evils, then we couldn't really say that God is omniscient. So now we have a problem. There are two general philosophical approaches to the problem of evil, whether we're talking about Jewish philosophy or Christian philosophy or Muslim philosophy, and we're concentrating mainly on these philosophies in antiquity and the Middle Ages. One solution I call the consider the whole approach. And the consider the whole approach takes two forms, a quantitative version and a qualitative version. And what they have in common is that they ask you to broaden your perspective. You see these evils, you think there's a problem, but the idea is that if you were to take a larger view of things, you would see that there's not really a problem. And sometimes the larger view of things is you have to look at more things. And the other solution is, well, you don't really have to look at more things, you just have to look at a different kind of thing. And we'll see how these two sorts of solutions play out in the philosophers we're going to talk about. The other approach is to abandon the consider the whole approach altogether and ask, what is God's providence like? How does God manage the world? And maybe that would give us a more direct answer as to why there are at least these apparent imperfections. Now, I should say that philosophers don't agree that there really are imperfections. Some philosophers say, well, yeah, there are. There really are evils in the world. Other philosophers would say, no, they just seem to be evil because you're not taking the right approach. So we'll look at the way in which those two theories play out as well. Now, the problem of evil in Jewish philosophy first appears in Jewish literature with the book of Job. And the story's fairly familiar to you. Job is described at the beginning of the book as Tam v'Yashar. He's whole, he's on the straight and narrow. Job is a good man, and yet he suffers miserably. We know why he suffers because we have a little prologue of the book where God and Satan are making a bet. Job has no knowledge of that, and there's a great deal of scholarly question about whether that prologue really belongs to the poem itself. But as far as Job knows, he's suffering undeservedly. He's lost everything. He's lost his family, he's lost his material goods, and now by a certain point in the story, he's suffering physically himself in his body. Finally, contrary to God's expectations, Job complains to God and says, "You are treating me unjustly. I don't deserve this." And Job actually questions God's justice. He says, "Why does God rain blows upon me without cause? Does God destroy the blameless and the wicked and the just alike?" So by that point, Job is actually questioning God's justice, and this raises the problem of evil. How could a God who is supposed to be wise and just allow me, Job, to suffer this way? Well, Job's friends come in, and like all friends, put him in his place. And this is one of the speeches, Elihu, one of Job's friends, but all the speeches have a certain theme in common. All of Job's friends basically say, if you're suffering, it's because you deserve it. This is what Elihu says. "Far be it from God to do evil, or the Almighty to play false, for he pays a man according to his work, and sees that he gets what his conduct deserves. The truth is, God does no wrong. The Almighty does not pervert justice." The theme in all of the friends' speeches is that if you are being punished, you must have sinned. Because a just God would never allow a truly innocent person to suffer. But you are suffering, therefore you must have sinned. Another way of putting this is that Job's friends all assume that God operates by principles of justice which are transparent to us. Essentially, the same principles of justice that we expect to follow in our lives. Justice ordinarily says, the virtuous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. And if God operates by those same principles, then if Job is suffering, he must be guilty of something. This notion that God operates by the same principles of justice, transparent principles of justice that guide us in our political, our economic, and our social lives, and our moral lives, this is a very questionable assumption. And in fact, it's questioned in the book of Job itself at the end. That initial premise about God being just in a transparent, almost human-like way, that's not the moral of the book. And even Elihu says, God is so great that we cannot know him. And then God himself comes down out of the heavens and sets everything right, essentially saying, you guys do not know what you're talking about. In fact, not only are you ignorant, but you have no right to proclaim to ever coming to know my ways. Can you deny that I am just or put me in the wrong that you may be right, God says? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know and understand. Who settled its dimensions? Who stretched his measuring line over it? On what do its supporting pillars rest? The challenge that God is posing here is this, that the distance between you and me is so infinite that you cannot possibly hope to understand the principles of justice by which I work. They might be like your principles of justice, human principles of justice, but they might not be, and you will never know. Not because you haven't done your homework, but because it is in principle impossible for a finite human being to understand the infinite. You weren't there when I created the world. You have no idea how I operate. And so the book of Job ends on a note which suggests the problem of evil cannot possibly be resolved. And a resolution, I should say, there's a term that philosophers have since Leibniz in the 17th century for resolving the problem of evil. It's called theodicy, from the Greek terms theos, meaning God, and dike, meaning justice. And a theodicy is a solution to the problem of evil. And the book of Job seems to end on the claim that theodicy is a foolish enterprise. You cannot hope to come up with a reasonable solution to the problem of evil. But philosophers being philosophers, they said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so we have a long tradition within Jewish thought, just as there's a similarly long tradition in Christian and Muslim thought, for trying to resolve this problem. And let's begin with Philo of Alexandria, who was active in the 1st century of the Common Era. Philo, he's a very interesting character. He probably did not know Hebrew. He lived in Greek, within the Greek dominions, and he wrote in Greek. He read Greek, probably did not know Latin, and probably did not know Hebrew, and so his familiarity with rabbinic literature might have been fairly minimal. But Philo took very seriously the problem of evil and offers us 2 solutions. His first, here's his statement of the problem of evil. Blessings in complete abundance are heaped upon the most wicked and worthless of mankind, such as wealth, a high reputation, honor in the eyes of the multitude, authority, health, a good condition of the outward senses, beauty, strength, and an unimpeded enjoyment of all good things. While the lovers of wisdom and the practicers of wisdom and prudence and every kind of virtue, every one of them, I may almost say, are poor, unknown, inglorious, and in a mean condition. That strikes me as a bit of an exaggeration, but it's a good statement of the problem. You look around you, and while not every wicked person may be prospering, you do see wicked people being elected. Well, no, sorry. I didn't say that. Nope. You see wicked people prospering, and you see virtuous people apparently suffering. Philo offers us 2 solutions. One solution is to say, well, in fact, the wicked are not really prospering. And the whole problem of evil is based on a kind of ignorance. And what he means when he says the wicked aren't really prospering, he means this in 2 ways. First of all of these alleged goods that the wicked enjoy are not true goods. Wealth, honor, power, these are transient, temporary, very mutable goods. You can gain power, you can gain wealth, but you can lose it. And whether you gain honor and power and wealth is very often not something that's under your control, but under the control of fortune and what other people think of you and so on. And so these are not true goods, because true goods are lasting. They persist through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And the true goods are not the material goods that we see the wicked prospering with, but goods of the soul, knowledge, wisdom, a sense of justice, an appreciation of beauty. These are true goods, and the wicked don't enjoy those. He also says that the wicked are not really prospering because even though they seem to be enjoying this material good fortune, it comes with a lot of pain and anxiety. The richer you are, the more you worry about maintaining and increasing and possibly losing your wealth. So with these material goods comes pain and suffering of a sort. So they're not really prospering. It says, do not ever be so deceived and wander from the truth to such a degree as to think that any wicked man is happy, even though he may be richer than Croesus and more sharp-sighted than Lycaeus, and more powerful than Milo of Crotona, and more beautiful than Ganymede. Because such a man is the slave of 10,000 different masters, such as love, appetite, pleasure, fear, pain, folly, intemperance, cowardice, and justice. He can never possibly be happy, even if the multitude, being utterly misled and deprived of their judgment, were to think him so. They're not really happy. His second solution is to say, and this is where the consider the whole approach comes in, he says, well, yes, sometimes the virtuous do suffer, but that's because of the generality of nature's ways. The laws of nature are what they are, and they don't take into account the expectations and needs of individuals. So you can plan your picnic for Sunday, but the laws of nature don't care whether you've planned for your picnic. It's going to rain or not going to rain, come what may by the laws of nature. And the setup of nature is on the whole good, because God created a good world, even if sometimes the laws of this good world have unfortunate consequences for us, because it can't take into account every particular situation. So the general plan set up by God is good, even if it means, by bad luck, sometimes the virtuous will suffer. In pestilential diseases, it is necessary that some of those who are not guilty should be involved in the destruction. For example, a virtuous person living where a tornado hits. It is inevitable that those who are exposed to a pestilential atmosphere must become diseased, even if they're virtuous, just as all persons who are exposed to a storm on board a ship must all be exposed to equal danger. Nature does not take into account personal, particular circumstances. And that's why sometimes we see the virtuous suffer. It's not because they deserve it, but because that's how nature on the whole, which is good, operates. All right, let's jump ahead about 8 centuries, and we come to Saadia ben Joseph. Saadia was the intellectual, religious leader of the Jewish community in Babylon, and at this point in time, he was perhaps the most important Jewish intellectual figure because the center of Jewish learning was in the academies in Babylon. Saadia introduces a new element to theodicy, to resolving the problem of evil. And again, it's more of a consider the whole thing. He says, do not judge God's justice without taking a very extensive perspective on a person's fate. You see a virtuous person suffering, and you see a wicked person prospering in this life. But if you're going to base your judgment on what you see in this life, you're awfully short-sighted, because there is a much longer framework within which you should consider things, and that is what he calls the world to come. The world to come is the world after this world, where immortal souls will receive their just deserts. And it's in the world to come where the true deserts of a person are issued. If you're truly virtuous, it's in the world to come that you will get your reward. If you are truly wicked, then while you may prosper in this world, it's in the next world, the world to come, where you will be punished properly. God has also informed us that during our entire sojourn in this workaday world, he keeps a record of everyone's deeds. The recompense for them, however, that is the true and lasting recompense, has been reserved by him for the second world, which is the world of compensation. This latter world will be brought into being by him when the entire number of rational beings, the creation of which has been decided upon by his wisdom, will have been fulfilled. And there, in that next world, he will requite all of them according to their deeds. Now, what this means is that the truly virtuous person, as he says here, is a person whose merits, whose good deeds, outnumber the bad deeds in this life. When merits predominate in the soul, the latter is thereby purified and luminous. When the demerits are in the majority in it, the soul becomes turbid and darkened. And so he is to be called pious, in whose conduct the good deeds predominate. That is, at least 51% of your deeds in this lifetime are good. And he is to be designated as impious, in whose conduct evil deeds are predominant. That is, who has 49 or less % of good deeds in this lifetime. However, God, being perfectly just, must reward a person for their good deeds and punish them for their bad deeds. So let's say that you are, by this measurement, let's say you are a bad or vicious person. So 49% of your, at best, 49% of your deeds are good, 51% of your deeds are bad. So you are a wicked person. But because you had some good deeds, in this life, you will be rewarded. You will get good things, because a just God will not leave your good deeds unrewarded. But in the next world, you will get the true recompense you deserve. And if 51% or more of your deeds are bad, that means in the next world, where reward and punishment are eternal, you will be punished. If you're a good person, that is, if at least 51% of your deeds are virtuous, it's likely that you still have performed some bad deeds. Everyone commits a sin now and then. There are no perfect saints. And so a just God cannot leave those bad deeds unpunished. That would be unjust. Everybody has to get dessert for what they've done. But because your bad deeds are in the minority of what you did in this lifetime, you will be punished in this life for your bad deeds, the minority. Are you following this? And in the next life, you will get the true reward for the majority of your deeds, which are good. It is furthermore a general rule laid down in this matter by the All-Wise to requite his servants in this world for the minority of their deeds, and leave the majority of their deeds for the next world, since it would not be seemly to transfer them in that other world from one status to another. Saadia would have been a good insurance agent, I think. He therefore instituted recompense in this world only for the lesser portion of a person's conduct, as he also explained that the totality of his merits is reserved for a far-off time, whereas the small proportion of his demerits is dealt with in this world. On the basis of this principle, it often happens that a generally virtuous person may be afflicted with many failings on account of which he deserves to be in torment for the greater part of this life. On the other hand, a generally impious individual may have to his credit many good deeds, for the sake of which he deserves to enjoy well-being for the greater part of his earthly existence. Here's the catch, though. If you repent, everything's fixed. So let's say you are a vicious person by his definition. 51% of your deeds were vicious, 49% were good. And so in this life, you prosper, you get rewarded for your good deeds, but what you're facing in the world to come is an eternity of torment. However, on your deathbed, you repent all of your bad deeds. You're in great shape. If the repentance is sincere, then you will be rewarded as a virtuous person in eternity. Of course, it's a double-edged sword. Let's say you are a virtuous person in this life. 51% of your deeds are good. 49% of your deeds are bad. So you've experienced misery in this lifetime, but you are awaiting eternal reward for the 51% of your good deeds. But let's say on your deathbed you repent of your virtue. You think, God, I wish I hadn't been so virtuous. Now you're facing an eternity of misery and torment. The interesting feature of what Saadia is doing is that despite being a religious leader, he is a philosopher. And what he's doing is trying to rationalize God's justice in a very precise, almost quantitative way. And this notion that we can rationalize away the problem of evil and even hold God to certain rational standards of behavior and treat God as a rational moral agent who makes choices based upon compelling ethical reasons. This is a really interesting feature, I think, of Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages. And it reaches its peak in Maimonides, perhaps the greatest and most famous Jewish philosopher of all, living in the 12th century. Maimonides says that, and he takes the consider the whole approach first. And initially for him, the consider the whole approach is a quantitative issue. Essentially, he says, if you think that the world is full of evil, then you're not looking broadly enough. You're miscounting things. As a matter of fact, the number of good things in this world outweighs the number of bad things. And therefore, to think that the world that God has created is bad is a failure of judgment. The evils that we suffer, he says, are very few and occur only seldom. For you will find cities existing for thousands of years that have never been flooded or burned. Also, thousands of people are born in perfect health, whereas the birth of an infirm human being is an anomaly, or at least such an individual is very rare, for they do not form 100th or even 1,000th part of those born in good health. This is Maimonides speaking in the Guide of the Perplexed, his major philosophical treatise. The evils do not form a majority of occurrences upon the earth taken as a whole. Rather, they become common only in extreme circumstances, such as war. Why is that not a satisfying solution to the problem of evil? What's wrong with that approach? This is a real question. Think like philosophers. Right, if you're the infirm person or somebody who's at least witnessing infirmities, this hasn't answered your question at all. Your question isn't why is the world on the whole bad, it's why are there any evils or imperfections at all? If God is perfectly wise, good, just, omniscient, and omnipotent, why should there be any sins or suffering or imperfections in the world at all? Maimonides tries to respond then with a qualitative version of the consider the whole approach. It's not quantitative. In this case, consider the whole doesn't mean do more counting. And the problem with counting is that then you get a numbers game. You count, I counted eight evil things. Somebody else can say, no, I counted 9. And so that's going to be an endless dispute. But why not think of it not as a quantitative issue, but a qualitative one? Consider the whole doesn't mean count up how many bad things and how many good things there are, but look at the big picture. Yes, if you restrict your vision to this person or that situation, things look bad. But look at the beauty of the whole, and you'll see that these unfortunate circumstances, these sufferings and imperfections, are part of a whole that is on the whole beautiful, good, wise, and just. And just as a good musical composition requires some dissonances, and just as a good painting, let's say a Caravaggio, requires some shadows to highlight the other elements, so a world or a cosmos that is on the whole good, part of its goodness consists in the overall wisdom of the plan, and it may be that a part of that plan requires some suffering and sin. But rest assured that if you consider the wisdom manifested in that which exists, and the excellence and the true reality of the whole, you'll be satisfied that God's justice is not impugned. God's wisdom is not impugned. Man and nothing else is the most perfect and the most noble thing that has been generated from this inferior matter. But if his being is compared to that of the spheres, and all the more to that of the separate beings, it's very contemptible. So don't judge the cosmos because you see humanity as imperfect. Human beings are what they are, and they're certainly important in God's creation. But they are not the be-all and end-all of the cosmos. And so if there is sin and suffering among humanity, that does not undermine the overall goodness, justice, and wisdom of the whole. This, Maimonides thinks, comes closer to answering the question, but one still wants to know, why am I suffering? Why is my life not perfect? Why am I the victim of sin or of unethical behavior? Why am I not flourishing and enjoying a perfectly happy life? And here Maimonides says, well, look, we need to totally shift our gears. And let's not think in terms of looking at the big picture, but consider yourself, what you are, and how you relate to God's plan. Or in other words, Maimonides says, let's turn to a consideration of God's providence itself. And how does God's providence work in our lives? And how does it protect us from evils? And if I'm suffering evils, how can I explain that in relationship to God's providence? One thing Maimonides says most definitely is that you should not think of divine providence as if God is a kind of person hurling thunderbolts at the wicked and personally dragging the virtuous out of the lion's den. Maimonides does not offer an anthropomorphic God, a God who is a kind of personal agent who responds to each person's needs. God doesn't do things like that. God is not actively involved in our lives, because that would be to treat God as if God were a kind of old guy with a beard. Rather, God's cosmos is structured in such a way that we can take advantage of certain features of this cosmos. And when we take advantage of them, we will enjoy a kind of protection from the vicissitudes of fortune. We will find a kind of immunity from the evils that surround us in the world, and we can achieve a kind of happiness. Here's what he means. There is in the world, and it emanates from God, a kind of wisdom. I like to think of it as a Wi-Fi system. God is outside the spheres of the cosmos, emanating this wisdom down through the spheres, the planetary spheres, and that wisdom is there for us to access. So, let me sure I get my technology right. If God's wisdom is emanating as if it's a Wi-Fi, then each of us must have a connection. Yes, okay, that's good. Or the possibility of a connection. What's contained in this wisdom is a knowledge of the cosmos itself, a knowledge of the metaphysics of the universe, what the universe is, a knowledge of the physics of nature, the laws of nature, why things happen as they do, and also a knowledge of moral truths. A virtuous person, by Maimonides' definition, a virtuous person is a person who pursues this knowledge, who devotes him or herself to acquiring a deep understanding of this wisdom that emanates through the cosmos. If you are truly virtuous and you successfully hook in to this transmission, that is, if you acquire this knowledge and understanding, this wisdom, you have an advantage as you navigate your way through the world. For example, there's a ship that's about to sail. And this is an example that Maimonides uses. It's a very touching example because he lost his brother David in a shipwreck at sea, and it just crushed him emotionally. There's a ship that's about to sail. Should you get on this ship? Well, the non-virtuous person will say, hell yeah, I'll get on the ship. It's going somewhere and I'll get rich. So they just get on the ship. And then a storm comes, the ship sinks, and the person's dead. Not because God has directly punished them for their viciousness, but because this person didn't know that a storm was coming. Or maybe this person didn't see that the captain was drunk, or incompetent navigators were running the ship. The virtuous person will know not to get on that ship because they know the weather forecast, they look at who the captain is, they consider the circumstances of the sailing. And so with this knowledge of the world, they can avoid the evils that might come their way just by good or bad luck. He says, divine providence is consequent upon the divine overflow. That's the Wi-Fi transmission. Providence is consequent upon the intellect and attached to it. For providence can only come from an intelligent being, from one who is an intellect perfect with a supreme perfection, than which there is no higher. Accordingly, everyone with whom something of this overflow is united, that is, everybody who has tapped into the Wi-Fi transmission, who acquires through, it doesn't come to you, you have to work at it, you have to acquire this wisdom, but if you've got it, you will be reached by providence to the extent to which you are reached by the intellect. And when any individual has obtained, because of the disposition of his body and his training, a greater proportion of this overflow than others, providence will of necessity watch more carefully over him than over others. If that is to say, providence is, as I have mentioned, consequent upon the intellect. That is, the more you perfect your intellect, the more protected you are. Not because God's protecting you, but because you have, in a way, put yourself under an umbrella. Accordingly, divine providence does not watch in an equal manner over all the individuals of the human species, but providence is graded as their human perfection is graded. The more perfect you are, the more immune you are to bad luck, because you can navigate your way past that luck. This is what philosophers call moral luck. The extent to which your well-being and your flourishing and your happiness, to what extent is it subject to factors beyond your control? In Maimonides' view, for the virtuous person, they are in control of their happiness and well-being. They are not subject to luck. They can navigate successfully. The vicious person, that is the person whose life is one of vice, who hasn't perfected their intellect, this person is at the mercy of circumstances beyond their control. They are at the mercy of luck. The vicious person might flourish, not because they deserve to, but because of good luck. But then again, they might suffer. And in that sense, they do deserve their suffering because they are responsible for the fact that they are not protected by the umbrella, that is, by the knowledge and wisdom that the virtuous person has. What happens when a virtuous person suffers? Well, Maimonides is saying they never do. Because as long as you are virtuous, you are enjoying this protection. If you should be suffering, that means you have stepped outside the umbrella. Or as he puts it, you have become distracted. You are no longer hooked up to the Wi-Fi emanation. And to the extent that you are not focusing on this wisdom, but maybe paying attention to something else, you're not enjoying that protection. And so you deserve whatever comes your way. With regard to providence watching over excellent men and neglecting the ignorant, it is said, "He will keep the feet of his holy ones, but the wicked shall be put to silence in darkness, for not by strength shall men prevail." It says thereby that the fact that some individuals are preserved from calamities, where those calamities befall others, is due not to their bodily forces and their natural dispositions, but to their perfection and deficiency. I mean, their nearness to or remoteness from God, that is, their wisdom. For this reason, those who are near to God are exceedingly well protected, whereas those who are far from him are given over to whatever may happen to befall them. For there is nothing to protect them against whatever may occur, for they are like one walking in darkness, whose destruction is assured. It is totally up to you whether you are going to enjoy this providential perfection, because it's totally up to you whether you are pursuing wisdom or not. I'll just read this quickly because we're running out of time. The providence of God, may he be exalted, is constantly watching over those who obtain this overflow, which is permitted to everyone who makes efforts with a view to obtaining it. If a man's thought is free from distraction, if he apprehends God, may he be exalted in the right way, and rejoices in what he apprehends, that individual can never be afflicted with evil of any kind. I'm not sure. I think he kind of means that. I'll explain that in a second. For he is with God and God is with him. When, however, he abandons him, may he be exalted, and is thus separated from God and God separated from him, he becomes in consequence of this a target for every evil that may happen to befall him. For the thing that necessarily brings about providence and deliverance from the sea of chance consists in that intellectual overflow. Yet an impediment may prevent from some time the overflow reaching the excellent and good man in question. Or again, it was not obtained at all by such and such a perfect and wicked man, and therefore the chance occurrences that befell them happened. This great providence and the safeguard and protection from all bother is, if you should happen to pass on your way a widely extended field of battle, and even if 1,000 were killed to your left and 10,000 to your right, no evil at all would befall you. Kind of like that, you're walking like Mr. Magoo, you're walking through this battle, spears and arrows are flying everywhere, but you're not even going to get a scratch. Does he mean that? Yes and no. I think he does mean that the more you enjoy this providence, that is, the more you pursue wisdom, the less likely you are to stub your toe or get on a ship that's going to sink. The less likely you are to suffer material evils. But even the virtuous person will always get a paper cut or slice their hand while cutting an avocado or something. And so what he also means is that the virtuous person knows that these afflictions of the body are not true afflictions. They're just afflictions of the body. True afflictions are afflictions of the soul, and the virtuous person will never suffer afflictions of the soul. They will never, no true evils will befall them. Maybe they'll cut their finger, but no true evils, no spiritual evils will ever befall them. Okay, our last stop, of course, is Spinoza. And Spinoza basically says, everything these guys say is Bubbenices, which is Yiddish for old wives' tales. Spinoza says that all the prejudices, and this is a work called The Ethics, which he didn't publish in his lifetime, wisely so, because he got in enough trouble for what he did publish, and had he published The Ethics, then everyone's belief that he was an atheist would have been justified. He said, all the prejudices I here undertake to expose depend on this one, that men commonly suppose that all natural things act as men do on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain as certain that God himself directs all things to some certain end. For Spinoza, the notion that there is such a thing as a supernatural providential God, a God who has the psychological characteristics that are portrayed in Hebrew Scripture, a God who has moral characteristics like wisdom and justice, this is a superstitious, false, and in fact dangerous conception of God. To think that God is a kind of supernatural providential agent is, if you think that, you are going to live your life enslaved by the passions of hope and fear, hope for eternal reward and fear of eternal punishment. And a person who lives their life enslaved by these passions is not a free person. They're not flourishing. They're not rational. And so Spinoza says, God is just nature. All there is nature. And nature is neither good nor bad. It just is. Whatever happens just happens by the laws of nature. Nothing in itself is good or bad. There are no purposes to nature. There are no purposes in nature. Nothing exists for the sake of something else. Everything comes about through the necessities of the laws of nature. See, I ask you, how the matter has turned out in the end. And this is why people think that there's a problem of evil. Among so many conveniences in nature, they had to find many inconveniences. He's talking about the superstitious people who are trying to solve the problem of evil. Storms, earthquakes, diseases, and so on. These, they maintain, happen because the gods, whom they judge to be of the same nature as themselves, are angry on account of wrongs done to them by men or on account of sins committed in their worship. And though their daily experience contradicted this, and though infinitely many examples showed that conveniences and inconveniences happen indiscriminately to the pious and the impious alike, they did not on that account give up their long-standing prejudice. It was easier for them to put this among the other unknown things, whose use they were ignorant of. And so they remained in the state of ignorance in which they had been born, than to destroy that whole construction and think up a new one. So they maintained it as certain that the judgments of the gods far surpass man's grasp. What Spinoza does think is that we can understand why bad things happen to us and why good things happen to us because we can understand nature. And the way in which Maimonides rationalizes and even naturalizes divine providence, Spinoza takes this to its ultimate conclusion. Yes, knowledge will bring you flourishing. Because the more you know, the more virtuous you are in that sense, the better off you are in this life. There is no afterlife. There's no immortal soul. There's no world to come. That's all superstition. All there is your life in this world. And you will be better off in this world through the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, because virtue has its rewards, its natural causal rewards in this life. The more this knowledge, what you do come to know when you study nature is that everything happens through the laws of nature and everything is necessary. It's a very stoic attitude. A lot of that happens out there is beyond your control. So if you're going to get all worked up by the comings and goings of things, you're going to be a very unhappy person. But once you recognize that you can't control those things, the result will be a kind of equanimity, tranquility, and peace of mind, and that's happiness. The more this knowledge that things are necessary is concerned with singular things, things around us, which we imagine more distinctly and vividly. The greater is this power of the mind over the affects, over our emotions, as experience itself also testifies. We see that sadness over some good that has perished is lessened as soon as the man who has lost it realizes that this good could not in any way have been kept. It was beyond his control. All you can control are your feelings, your beliefs, your judgments, and your values. You can't control those things out there. Similarly, we see that because we regard infancy as a natural and necessary thing, no one pities infants because of their inability to speak, to walk, or to reason, or because they live so many years, as it were, unconscious of themselves. Knowledge of necessity in nature, knowledge of nature, brings a calming of the passions. If there's a kind of divine providence, and for Spinoza, if God is nature, then divine providence is just the natural results of the way in which we can come to control ourselves and come to control our passions. And so the upshot of this long Jewish rationalist tradition in trying to explain evil, I think ends up in a very rational, naturalistic dismissal of the problem of evil, and an attempt to reinforce the view that there's still benefits to being a good person, but they don't come from some supernatural being, or they don't result in an expectation of some world to come. And I think Spinoza's last word is, as for providence, whatever human nature can effect solely by its own power to preserve its own being can rightly be called God's internal help. Remember, but again, God is just nature. And whatever falls to a man's advantage for the power of external causes can rightly be called God's or nature's external help. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow.
We have a few minutes for questions. If you want.
Sure, yeah.
I don't understand.
Can you hear him back
I
there?
don't understand how the idea of the omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent God ever got off the ground. The people live in a much harsher world than we live in, with infant mortality, with everything that was going on, protection from warm and cold and famine. So I don't know how it caught on, and to the point where you have hundreds and thousands of years of philosophers trying to explain it without dismissing it. It would be like I get up here and say, I'm the smartest person that ever lived. You can talk to me for 30 seconds and figure out that's not true. Or you could decide, well, he is the smartest person that ever lived. I've been told that. How does this make sense? He doesn't look like he is. Well, maybe I don't know what smart is. Or maybe he's so smart that when he says something that looks dumb, I'm not getting it.
Right, so your question is well taken. And here's an answer that shouldn't satisfy you. Well, because look at the Bible. Well, in fact, if you read at least the Hebrew Bible, that God is not the God who's omnipotent, omniscient, wise, all just. This is a jealous God who's subject to unpredictable emotions, a God who sometimes seems ignorant of things, a God who sometimes seems less than omnipotent. The omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all-wise, all-good, all-just God is a construct of the theologians. And I'm including Jewish theologians. It's especially clear, I think, in Christian theology of the Middle Ages, that you, through the fathers of the church, Origen, St. Augustine, and so on, construct a very philosophical conception of God which has these attributes. But even in the rabbinic literature, you see the ancient rabbis wrestling with the problem of evil without necessarily attributing to God these specific attributes, but they do have certain expectations that God the Father will behave in a certain paternalistic way towards God's creatures. And so maybe not with those precise attributes of the omni attributes. Nonetheless, there are the problem of evil gets off the ground as soon as you make certain expectations that God has a predictable kind of behavior. You can see it in the ancient Israelite prophets. Isaiah, for example, is very clear that God gets angry with those who disobey, but will reward those who follow God's commandments. So all you really need is thinking of God as a kind of moral agent who acts on some transparent principles of morality. Yes?
Well, I appreciate your studiousness and your being a good student, but I'm wondering as you delved in all this, where you personally find your meaning, you know.
So who do I think got it right?
Well, no, just I'm imagining a piece of this and a piece of that, but I'm curious. Yeah.
I'm especially partial to Spinoza. I think the project of dispelling superstition, prejudice, merely imaginative conceptions of things that only lead to misdirected behavior, I think that's the right philosophical project. And I think Spinoza got a lot of it right about what it is to be a good person, what it is to lead a good life, and not just good as virtuous, but to flourish and to excel as a human being, and to live, to become a maximally flourishing human being. I think he makes a lot of sense in that.
Part of the question is, if you have a concept of justice, where does the justice come from?
Well, so his question was, if you have a concept of justice, where does that concept of justice come from? So let me take that back to Socrates for a minute. In one of Plato's earliest dialogues, Socrates is heading toward the courts because he's about to be put on trial for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. And he runs into a friend of his named Euthyphro, and Euthyphro is going to the courts to prosecute his father for murder. And Socrates says, well, why are you doing that? He says, well, it's the just thing to do. He says it's the pious thing to do, but he means it's the just thing to do. Socrates says, well, what is justice? And of course, that leads to questions, answers, and Euthyphro gets frustrated and walks away. But in this dialogue, you have a clash between two different conceptions of where justice comes from. Euthyphro begins by saying that justice is what the gods love. If the gods love something, then it's just. If the gods love that, it's just. On the other hand, if they love that, then that would be just. And Socrates says, well, the problem with that is, first of all, then justice becomes an arbitrary thing. Because if justice is determined by what the gods love, that means that nothing is just until a god loves it. Or let's put it in Abrahamic terms. If the origin of justice is God, and something is just only because God says it's just, then justice is an arbitrary and capricious thing, and it's meaningless to say that God is just. It's a trivial claim. So God likes X, therefore X is just. Or God commands X. Well, had God commanded Y, then it wouldn't be X that's just, it would be Y that's just. And so to say that God is just it's trivial. Anything God does is just. So Socrates says, and putting it back in Abrahamic terms, it must be that there is an objective standard of justice, independent even of God. And in that way we can say God is just because God abides by that rational concept of justice. And it all depends upon how you read those initial chapters of the Torah, of Hebrew Scripture. God looked at what God had created and saw that it was good. Was it good because God made it? Or God, and that would be Euthyphro's view, or did God make it because it's good? Did God choose this world rather than that world because this world is objectively better than that world? So your question is, to put it succinctly, do we need religion, or do you need a concept of God to have morality? And I think that's a real category mistake. It's conflating two very distinct things. What God commands, expects, or desires, that's a matter for religion and piety. That's got nothing to do with morality at all. Morality is a matter of justice and right and wrong, what we owe to other human beings, what we owe to ourselves. And to think that if there's no God, then there's no such thing as morality, that's just a really deep confusion about, I think, the nature of justice and morality. Yes?
What did Spinoza, how did he deal with the problem of hope?
Hope?
Hope.
Hope is a passion that we experience when we are expecting. He gives a very mundane definition. It's a passion we experience when we're expecting something in the future that is uncertain. And he thinks that while it's a better passion than fear, that a life guided by hope is better than a life guided by fear. In fact, both of these passions, especially if they're focused on something that's not even possible, are irrational and can lead only to unhappiness and disappointment. But I don't. On the other hand, hope, even in Spinoza's view, hope can have some beneficial effects as long as it leads you towards a life of reason rather than a life of passion. Actually, Spinoza is not saying you should get rid of your passions. He's not a Stoic in that very severe or austere sense. You can't be a human being and not have passions. The question is, though, whether the decisions you make in your life are guided by your passions or guided by reason. And the virtuous person is a person who, while they will experience passions, and maybe even enjoy some of those passions, the decisions they make will be based on reason. There's a hand up here a second ago.
If you have a system where you have God and you have a system of morality,
Right.
who's setting up the rules of morality?
So the question is, if you have God here and you have morality there, and so God is not the source of morality, what is the source of morality? Well, it depends which philosopher you ask. So I'll just give you
Not having an objective. Something setting an objective thing.
So it's true that so one solution you could say is there's nobody setting morality, it's such subjective. It's, if you think something's right, then something's right. But that's not really morality, that's just subjectivity. You could say that it's whatever rules that a particular society establishes. That's still a little too uncertain and unpredictable for my taste. So here's 3 quick answers that philosophers have given. One answer is that morality is grounded in human nature, that every human being, by virtue of being a human being, is endowed with a sense of sympathy. And sympathy is what allows us to make the proper moral assessments of other people and of actions. Feelings of right and wrong are universally endowed throughout human nature. Here's another answer. This is the answer that Kant gave, that every human being, by virtue of being rational, not through a feeling of sympathy, but every human being is endowed with reason. And through reason, we can discover the universal moral law, which is never act in such a way that you could not rationally will every human being to act in that way. And so there, the objective foundation of morality would be reason itself. Here's a third answer. Every human being, this is what Mill and utilitarians say, every human being by nature pursues happiness. Happiness is the good. And so our standard of right and wrong action is simply what actions will increase the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number. Now, you can't have all of those. Someone's got to be right and someone's got to be wrong. But that's what makes philosophy so interesting. We're trying to figure out. Those philosophers who believe that there is an objective standard of morality, trying to figure out what that is. Yes?
Do any of the people you studied speak directly or indirectly to the issue of people that have limited ability to reason, in modern terms, cognitive impairment, especially in the approach stream?
So what about people who suffer from some kind of cognitive impairment? Does that mean that, your question suggests that, does that mean that these people are kind of locked out of the good life, that they can never achieve this? So Maimonides would say yes, too bad. A lot of these philosophers, I'm sorry to say, were elitists in a very strong sense. Maimonides believed, in fact, that only prophets and philosophers can truly enjoy virtue to the highest degree, and thus enjoy this providence. The masses of people, they should do what they can to simply follow the laws of the rabbis, because these rabbis, or the laws of the prophets, because these will be good guidelines. Spinoza similarly says that very few people will be able to achieve true virtue through reason. Most people will be best served by so quick little digression here. He thinks that the Bible was written by human beings. It's just a work of human literature. There's no God commanding these things or writing these things down. But the authors of Scripture were morally upright, really morally superb human beings and very good storytellers. And so there is a sense in which the Bible is divine because it's a morally edifying work, and people who read it tend to get the right moral lessons from it. I don't know why he would think that about the Hebrew Bible, but so he does think about the Christian Gospels. And so the elite few can become virtuous through reason, through cognitive perfection. Most people, however, are best off reading a good novel, the Bible, or, if Shakespeare's plays are morally edifying, then they're divine in this sense, and they move you to virtue. So most people have to rely on a more imaginative, less rational way toward a good life. But the suggestion in your question is that there's a kind of elitism here, and that seems to be running through a lot of these thinkers. Yes?
So I'm curious, when did the idea of a world to come in which the good are rewarded and the unjust are punished come into Judaism?
That's a really good and difficult question. It's not in Hebrew scripture, except there are some passages in Daniel. In the apocryphal books, and especially the book of Enoch, you have very imaginative conceptions of the land of the dead. But generally, in biblical Judaism, when you die, your body goes to Sheol, and that's it. In the early rabbinic literature, you start to see the beginnings of a sense of, so the virtuous get continued life, the wicked are cut off, the karat, they're cut off. That suggests that they're dead, and the virtuous get to enjoy resurrection. That becomes quite a dogmatic, the notion that the resurrection of the body becomes quite a dogmatic aspect of rabbinic Judaism by the medieval period. Maimonides got in trouble because he was perceived to be denying that, because his focus was on the immortality of the soul, distinct from the body. So I would say, to try to answer your question, first of all, there's no single Jewish view on this. Some rabbis think that there is a world to come. It's distinct from this world, and that's where reward and punishment will be meted out. Other rabbis say the world to come is in this world, and it's the rewards that you enjoy from your virtue. Maimonides says among those who will not be allowed a place in the world to come are those who speculate on the world to come. So you should be thinking about it. So there's a great deal of debate about that, about whether the world to come is a world of embodied beings or disembodied souls. Is it the same as the Messianic period? Does it come after the Messianic period? But what's interesting is that you really see it come into its own when, in the Hellenistic period, when Jewish thinkers meet Greek philosophy, and especially Platonic philosophy. So that's sort of a messy answer to your question. Not a messianic answer, just a messy answer. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
So thank you again to everyone for coming out and supporting us.